My brother texted our parents treat us fairly when I stopped showing up because they refused to help me after I lost my job. So I replied they paid 6 months of your rent while I got a lecture about independence. The night I realized my parents had already decided who mattered more, I was sitting in my childhood bedroom at 32 years old, staring at a ceiling fan that still made the same faint clicking noise it did when I was a teenager. It was almost comforting in a sad way. The same room, the same noise, different version of me. Broke, unemployed, and apparently expected to just bounce back on command. This whole thing started with a single sentence my dad said over speakerphone like it was nothing, like it wasn't going to quietly rearrange the way I saw my family forever. I'd lost my job 2 weeks earlier. Not fired for doing something wrong, not laid off because the company collapsed overnight. It was worse than that because it was quieter. Restructuring new leadership, my role no longer aligned with the company's direction. I'd read the email 3 times before it actually sank in. I remember staring at my laptop after the call ended, half expecting another message to pop up saying there'd been a mistake. There wasn't. Just silence. And then the very real awareness that rent was still due, groceries still cost money, and health insurance didn't care about my feelings. I didn't call my parents right away, pride mostly. I'd always been the independent one. Not in the way they bragged about, but in the way that meant I didn't ask for much. I moved out early, paid my own way through most of college, took whatever job I could get afterward, and worked my way up slowly. No drama, no big requests. My younger brother Mark was the opposite. He was loud, impulsive, always in some kind of financial mess that everyone else seemed to rally around. They called him spirited. I called him exhausting. But somehow, his problems were always urgent and mine were always manageable. When I finally did call my parents, it was after I'd run the numbers 6 different times and realized I had maybe 2 months before things got ugly. I tried to sound calm and casual, like this was just a temporary hiccup. My mom listened quietly while I explained what happened. My dad cleared his throat a few times in that way he does when he's already forming a response and not really hearing the rest. Well, he said after a pause that felt just a little too long, "You're smart. You'll bounce back." That was it. No follow-up questions. No offer to help with rent for a month. No, "Do you need groceries or do you want to stay with us for a bit?" Just confidence. The kind that costs them nothing. I laughed because what else do you do when the people who raised you reduce your crisis to a motivational poster? I said something like, "Yeah, I hope so." We talked for a few more minutes about job boards and how the market's weird right now. And then my mom told me to keep my chin up. When we hung up, I sat there holding my phone, feeling smaller than I had in a long time. A week later, Mark called me, not to ask how I was doing. He never really did that. He wanted to complain about interest rates. He'd racked up a mix of credit card debt and some kind of personal loan I didn't fully understand, all tied to a business idea he'd dropped 6 months earlier. He laughed about it like it was all temporary, like it always was. "Don't worry," he said, cheerful as ever. "Mom and Dad are helping me straighten it out." That should have been my first real warning, but I brushed it off. Parents help their kids. I told myself it wasn't a competition, that my situation was different, that I was older, more capable, that needing help didn't mean I deserved it more. Still, little things started to add up. Family group chats where my job search was met with thumbs-up reactions while Mark's latest scheme got paragraphs of encouragement. Sunday dinners where my mom asked if I'd heard back from anyone yet, in that careful voice people use when they're already preparing for disappointment. Meanwhile, Mark talked freely about plans, trips, ideas that all required money he definitely did not have. 2 months passed like that. 2 months of rejections, interviews that went nowhere, savings draining faster than I wanted to admit. I took freelance work. I sold things I didn't need. I learned exactly how many days I could stretch a bag of rice and a pack of chicken thighs. I didn't tell my parents how bad it was getting. Part of me wanted to see how long it would take before they noticed on their own. They didn't. The moment everything shifted was a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. My mom had insisted I come over for dinner, saying it would be good to get out of the apartment. I showed up tired, thinner than usual, trying to look normal. Halfway through the meal, my dad raised his glass like he had an announcement. "We finally did it," he said, smiling. "Paid off Mark's debts, all of them." My mom beamed. Mark leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head like he'd personally achieved something remarkable. They talked about it openly, proudly. The numbers, the relief, how good it felt to get him back on track. No one looked at me. I sat there, fork paused, halfway to my mouth, doing the math in my head. The same parents who told me I'd bounce back had just written a check big enough to erase my brother's mistakes. The same parents who hadn't offered me a single month of help were celebrating a rescue mission they never once questioned. I smiled. I even congratulated Mark. What else could I do? But something in me went very quiet in that moment. Not angry, not yet. Just clear. They were right about one thing. I was going to bounce back, just not in the way they expected. I didn't say anything that night. I went home, lay awake in the dark, and replayed the dinner over and over. Every word, every laugh, every casual assumption that I'd be fine because I always was. And somewhere between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning, a thought settled in that felt uncomfortable but honest. If they were never going to see me as someone worth stepping in for, Then I needed to stop acting like I was waiting for them to. The next morning, I made a decision. A small one at first, then another, and another. Each one felt like stacking kindling quietly, carefully. No big speeches, no confrontations, just preparation. Because I was done asking for help from people who only offered it when it made them feel like heroes. I didn't confront them after that dinner. I didn't send a long message or make a dramatic exit. On the outside, nothing changed. I still showed up to family events. I still answered calls. I still played my role. But internally, something had shifted. I stopped explaining myself, stopped offering updates unless asked directly. I told myself I was conserving energy, but the truth was simpler. I was watching. The weeks after that dinner were some of the heaviest I've ever lived through. The job market stayed cold. Interviews came and went. Some companies ghosted me after 3 rounds like I'd never existed. Others sent polite rejection emails that all sounded the same, just different logos at the top. I woke up every morning with that familiar weight in my chest, the one that sits there for a few seconds before you even remember why it's there. I tracked every dollar. I skipped meals more often than I should have. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was still capable. I just needed time. My parents, meanwhile, seemed lighter than ever. Helping Mark had energized them. Every phone call somehow circled back to him. How relieved he was, how motivated, how this fresh start was exactly what he needed. They spoke like they'd invested wisely, like they'd backed the right horse and were already seeing returns. One afternoon, my mom called me while I was sitting in my car parked outside a coffee shop I couldn't really afford but needed for the Wi-Fi. She asked how things were going. I hesitated just for a second before answering honestly. "Still looking," I said. "It's been rough," she hummed sympathetically. "Well, you know these things happen for a reason." I waited. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't ask how I was managing. Instead, she shifted gears. "By the way," she said, "casual Mark's thinking about moving closer to us. He's talking about starting something new." I stared at the dashboard, fingers tight around my phone. "That's great," I said. "We might help him with a deposit," she added, "just to make sure he lands on his feet." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said nothing, and she filled the silence with reassurance meant for herself. "It's different with you, Brian. You've always been so self-sufficient." There it was. The compliment that felt like a sentence. That night, I checked my bank account again and realized I had exactly 26 days before rent became a real problem. I considered calling my parents back. Really calling. Laying it all out. Telling them I wasn't okay. That I needed help. That their confidence in my resilience was starting to feel less like faith and more like neglect. I didn't make the call. Part of me wanted to see just how far they'd let it go. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in layers. Small cutting moments that stacked on top of each other until something finally cracked. It started with my dad asking me to help Mark. We were all at my parents' house again, this time for my mom's birthday. Cake, coffee, the usual. Mark was talking animatedly about his new direction, waving his fork around like a presentation pointer. My dad turned to me mid-conversation. "Hey, Brian," he said, "you're good with numbers. Think you could help Mark put together a budget just to keep him on track?" I blinked. "A budget?" "Yeah," my dad said, "since he's starting fresh." I wanted to ask which part of my situation screamed financial advisor. I wanted to ask if anyone remembered that I was unemployed. Instead, I nodded slowly. "Sure," I said, "I can look at it." Mark grinned. "See, I told you he'd help." That night, Mark emailed me his numbers. Seeing them laid out like that felt surreal. The debts my parents had wiped, the cushion he now had, the monthly expenses that were somehow higher than mine had ever been, even when I was employed. At the bottom of the spreadsheet was a note. "Mom and Dad said you'd know what to do." I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time. It felt like a joke I was the only one not laughing at. A few days later, my mom asked if I could dog sit while they went away for a weekend. "Just 2 nights," she said. "You don't have much going on right now, right?" That one landed harder than it should have. Not because of the request, but because of how casually my situation was minimized. Like unemployment had turned me into a placeholder. Someone with unlimited availability and no real obligation. I agreed. Again, the real betrayal. The one that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it came 2 weeks after that. I got an email from my landlord titled Notice. My heart dropped before I even opened it. It wasn't an eviction notice yet, but it was close enough to make my hands shake. I needed help. Not advice, not encouragement, actual help. So I called my parents. I didn't sugarcoat it this time. I told them where I was at. I told them about the notice. I told them I needed short-term support just until I got back on my feet. I could hear my own voice shaking, and I hated that it was happening, but I pushed through it. There was a pause on the line. Too long. My dad finally spoke. "Well, Brian, we've already stretched ourselves thin helping Mark." My mom chimed in quickly. "We didn't realize things were that tight for you, but you're resourceful. You always figure it out." I felt something inside me give way. "So that's it?" I asked. "You can't help me at all." "It's not that we can't," my dad said. It's just not the right time. Not the right time. I thanked them for listening and hung up before my voice could betray me any further. 2 days later, I found out what not the right time really meant. Mark called me excited, too excited. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Mom and Dad just paid the first 6 months of my rent up front, said it would give me breathing room." I sat down on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding. 6 months, I repeated. "Yeah, they said they didn't want me stressing about money while I got my footing back." I didn't respond right away. Mark, oblivious as ever, kept talking about furniture and plans and how lucky he felt. When the call ended, I just sat there. The contrast was so stark it almost felt intentional. The timing, the choice. They hadn't just said no to me, they'd chosen him again immediately after. That was the moment everything crystallized. It wasn't oversight, it wasn't ignorance. It was a pattern. One they were comfortable with. One they expected me to accept quietly like I always had. I stood up, walked over to my closet, and started pulling out old boxes I hadn't touched in years. Documents, notes, things I'd saved without really knowing why. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I was looking for leverage. And as I sorted through those boxes, one memory surfaced that made my hand stop moving entirely. A conversation from years ago, a promise made casually, something my parents had assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't. I sat there on the floor surrounded by papers, feeling a strange mix of hurt and clarity. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect, about being invisible until I was useful. And for the first time since I lost my job, I wasn't thinking about how to survive the next month. I was thinking about how far this went. The thing about hitting rock bottom is it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There's no single crash, no cinematic moment where everything shatters at once. It's quieter than that. It's a slow erosion, a series of small losses that pile up until you wake up one morning and realize the version of yourself you used to be feels very far away. For me, rock bottom arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Mark told me about the 6 months of rent my parents had paid for him. I woke up to an email from my landlord asking if I'd had a chance to review the notice. The polite tone somehow made it worse, like he was giving me space to pretend this wasn't serious yet. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that made breathing feel shallow. I did the math again, even though I already knew the answer wouldn't change. I didn't have enough. I spent that day walking not toward anything in particular, just moving because sitting still felt unbearable. I passed places I used to go without thinking. Cafes I'd worked out of, stores I'd browsed on lunch breaks back when I had a lunch break. Everything looked the same, which somehow made it feel worse, like the world hadn't noticed I was falling behind. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called a friend I hadn't spoken to regularly since college, not to ask for money, just to talk. I didn't even tell him everything. I just said I was having a rough time. He listened, didn't rush to fix it, didn't minimize it. When we hung up, I realized how starved I'd been for that simple validation. The next week was brutal. I sold more things I actually cared about this time. I cut expenses down to almost nothing. I stopped pretending I was between jobs and started admitting to myself that I was struggling. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Once I stopped lying to myself, I could actually think clearly. I didn't tell my parents any of this, not out of spite, out of clarity. I already knew how that conversation would go. Encouragement without assistance, pride without presence. I couldn't afford that kind of disappointment anymore. The lowest moment came late one night when I was packing up more boxes, trying to decide what I could sell next. I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by half-filled boxes, and felt completely hollow. Not sad, not angry, just empty, like I'd been drained of whatever kept me going before. I remember thinking very clearly that if I stayed in that space too long, it would swallow me. So I did something small, something almost stupidly simple. I opened my laptop and made a list. Not of jobs I wanted, but of things I could actually do right now, skills. I had experience, I'd overlooked connections, I'd been too proud to reach out to. The list wasn't impressive at first. It didn't magically fix anything, but it was real. It was mine. And for the first time in weeks, it gave me something to focus on that wasn't just survival. I started reaching out quietly. No announcements, no social media posts about exciting new chapters. I sent emails to former coworkers, old clients, people I hadn't talked to in years. I didn't ask for favors. I asked for conversations, advice, temporary work, anything. Some never replied. Some did. One conversation turned into a small freelance project. That project paid less than I would have liked, but it paid. More importantly, it reminded me that I still had value, that I wasn't broken, just bruised. I worked obsessively nights, weekends. I treated that small project like it was the most important thing in the world because in a way it was. It was proof that I wasn't finished. During all of this, my parents barely checked in. When they did, it was surface level. Any updates? Still looking. My answers got shorter. Not out of bitterness, but because I was done narrating my struggle for people who only listened when it was convenient. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to be thriving, or at least performing thriving. New furniture, new plants, photos sent to the family group chat of his new place fully furnished, thanks to my parents' generosity. They reacted with heart emojis and exclamation points. I muted the chat for a while. As weeks passed, that one freelance project turned into 2, then 3. Nothing stable yet, but momentum. The kind that sneaks up on you when you're too busy working to notice. I started waking up with purpose again, not optimism purpose. There's a difference. One afternoon, I realized I hadn't checked my bank account obsessively in a few days. That realization hit me harder than any rejection email ever had. It meant I wasn't panicking every hour anymore. I was planning. I paid my landlord a partial amount and negotiated more time. It wasn't ideal, but it bought me space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to keep building. What surprised me most during that period wasn't the work, it was the emotional shift. Somewhere along the way, the hurt I'd been carrying about my parents started to change shape. It didn't disappear, but it sharpened, became more defined, less raw. I stopped wondering why they treated Mark differently and started accepting that they always had. That acceptance hurt, but it also freed me. I stopped trying to earn fairness, stopped hoping that if I explained myself better, they'd finally see me. I began to understand that their version of me was fixed, reliable, resilient, low maintenance. The son who didn't need help because he never asked for it loudly enough. So I stopped asking. As my work picked up, I began to notice something else, a pattern I'd ignored for years. I'd been the quiet support system more often than I remembered, helping my parents with tech, reviewing documents, giving advice, stepping in whenever something needed to be handled calmly and competently. I'd done it without keeping score because that's what you do when you assume mutual respect is a given. Now with some distance, I could see it clearly. They didn't see my help as sacrifice. They saw it as baseline. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me strategic. By the 3rd month, I wasn't back yet, but I wasn't drowning either. I had a rhythm, a growing client list, a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. I even started setting money aside again, small amounts at first, just to remind myself that forward movement was possible. My parents noticed the change before I said anything. My mom commented that I sounded better on the phone. My dad mentioned I seemed more confident. They didn't ask why. They didn't ask how. And that was fine because by then I wasn't rebuilding myself for them. I was rebuilding quietly, intentionally, with memory and clarity guiding every step. And all the while in the back of my mind sat that conversation from years ago, that promise, the one they'd assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't. As my footing stabilized and my confidence returned, I began to understand that what I was building wasn't just financial security. It was leverage independence that didn't require their approval strength, that didn't need their acknowledgement. I wasn't ready to act yet, not even close. But for the first time since losing my job, I could see a path forward that didn't end with me begging for scraps of validation. I wasn't at the top of the mountain, but I was no longer at the bottom. And the higher I climbed on my own, the clearer it became that the next phase wouldn't be about survival at all. It would be about choice. Once I stopped waking up in panic, once the fear of immediate collapse faded into something quieter and more manageable, my thoughts began to change in ways that surprised me. Not darker, clearer, focused. It's strange how stability doesn't make you forget what hurt you. It gives you the space to examine it properly. I didn't think of what I was doing as revenge at first. That word felt too loud, too emotional. What I was doing felt calmer than that, colder maybe. I started calling it preparation. The first thing I did was stop reacting. No more immediate replies to family messages. No more jumping in when my dad needed something real quick. No more filling silences with reassurance when my mom worried aloud about Mark's stress levels. I became pleasant, neutral, unavailable in small, deniable ways. Always polite, never confrontational, just busy. They didn't notice right away. They rarely did. What they did notice eventually was that I wasn't volunteering anymore. When the Wi-Fi went down at my parents' house, and my dad texted asking if I could swing by, I told him I was tied up with work. When my mom asked if I could review a document for her friend, I said I'd look at it later and never followed up. When Mark asked if I could help him think through a decision, I told him I trusted his judgment. Each time there was a pause on the other end. Confusion, mild annoyance, then acceptance. They'd always assumed my availability was permanent. Turns out it wasn't. Around that same time, my work shifted again. One of the clients I'd been freelancing for asked if I could take on a bigger role, more responsibility, longer term. It wasn't a full-time offer, but it was close enough to change how I planned my weeks. It came with more money, more visibility, and more say. I accepted without hesitation. With that came access meetings, conversations, decisions I hadn't been part of before. And with access comes information whether you're looking for it or not. I started learning things, not about my family at first, but about systems, how money moved, how decisions were justified, how narratives were shaped to make certain outcomes feel inevitable. I realized how often people with resources framed their choices as necessities rather than preferences. That realization circled back to my parents in a way I couldn't ignore. They hadn't helped Mark because they had to. They'd helped him because they wanted to, because it fit the story they'd been telling themselves for years. Mark needed rescuing. I didn't. Understanding that stripped away the last layer of confusion I'd been clinging to. One evening, while organizing files for work, I came across an old folder I'd carried from computer to computer for years. I hadn't opened it in a long time. Inside were scanned documents, notes, emails, things I'd saved without fully understanding why at the time, just knowing they might matter someday. That was when I found it again, the thing that had stopped me cold back in my apartment weeks earlier. Years ago, when my parents were downsizing their finances, they'd asked for my help. Budget projections, account consolidation, long-term planning. They trusted me with it because I was good with details, because I wouldn't panic, because I wouldn't judge. During that process, my dad had made an offhand comment, half joking, half serious. If anything ever happens to us, he'd said, "You're the one we trust to handle things." At the time, it sounded like responsibility, like respect, like something that meant I mattered. Later, there'd been more. Emails, notes, a draft document that never became official, but existed nonetheless. A contingency plan. A quiet acknowledgement that despite everything, I was the stable one. They'd assumed it was forgotten because it was never formalized, never discussed again. Life moved on. Mark's chaos took center stage. My reliability faded into the background. But records don't forget. I didn't smile when I found those files again. I feel triumphant. I felt grounded, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. This wasn't about embarrassing them or confronting them or demanding apologies I knew would never come in the way I needed. This was about timing. From that point on, I started paying closer attention during family conversations. Not emotionally, practically. I noticed what they worried about, what they assumed was handled, what they deferred without thinking. My mom complained about paperwork piling up. My dad mentioned being overwhelmed with certain responsibilities. Mark talked openly about plans that depended heavily on continued financial support as if it were guaranteed. No one asked me what I thought. That was fine. I also started reconnecting with people from my past. Quietly, old coworkers who'd moved into roles with influence, friends who'd started businesses, contacts I'd let drift when I was too busy trying to prove I could do everything on my own. I didn't tell them about my family. I didn't vent. I talked about work, ideas, opportunities. I listened more than I spoke. One conversation led to another. One favor turned into collaboration. Slowly, intentionally, my network expanded in directions I hadn't anticipated before losing my job. And with every step forward, I felt something else building alongside it. Distance. The emotional kind. I stopped craving my parents' approval, stopped replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I should have said something differently. Their choices became data points instead of wounds. That's when I knew I was ready. Not to act yet, but to position myself. The opportunity I'd been waiting for didn't announce itself dramatically. It came disguised as a problem. My dad called one evening voice tense. He said he needed advice. Something about restructuring assets. Nothing urgent, but important. He asked if I had time to talk. I looked at my calendar, at the work I'd built, at the stability I'd earned on my own. "I can make time," I said as he spoke, explaining the situation. I felt the full weight of what he was asking without realizing it. He trusted me, still, enough to lean on me when things felt uncertain. What he didn't know was that I was listening differently now, not as the son hoping to be seen, but as someone evaluating leverage. By the time the call ended, I knew exactly what my next steps would be. Not immediately, not recklessly, carefully, because the most effective setups don't look like threats, they look like help. The moment I knew it was time didn't come with anger or adrenaline. It came with paperwork. My dad asked me to come by on a Saturday morning. He framed it like a favor the way he always did when he didn't want to sound like he was asking for help. He said he needed a second set of eyes on some documents. Asset reorganization. Nothing dramatic, just making things cleaner for the future. I remember driving over and feeling almost calm. Not numb, calm. The kind that comes when you've already made peace with what you're about to do. My parents' house looked the same as it always had. Same driveway. Same creaky front step. Same framed photos on the wall, all milestones and smiles and carefully cropped moments that never showed tension. Mark's picture was newer than mine, bigger frame. I noticed that without emotion, like noting the weather. We sat at the dining table, papers spread out neatly. My dad talked. My mom hovered, chiming in when she felt something needed smoothing over. They were stressed but not panicked. They still assumed things were under control. They assumed I was under control. As I read through the documents, everything I'd suspected was confirmed. The structure they'd built relied heavily on one assumption, that I would continue to be the quiet, competent backstop, the one who understood the details, the one who could be counted on to step in if something went wrong, the one who wouldn't rock the boat. They had leaned on that assumption for years without ever acknowledging it. I set the papers down and looked up. "There's a risk here," I said, keeping my voice neutral. My dad frowned. "What kind of risk?" "The kind that happens when responsibilities aren't clearly defined," I replied. "You're assuming someone will handle certain things automatically." My mom nodded. "That's why we wanted your input." That was my opening, not the explosive kind, the quiet one. "I'm happy to give input," I said, "but I won't be the fallback anymore." The room went still. My dad blinked. "What do you mean, I said calmly. "I've been filling that role without it ever being formalized, acknowledged, or supported. And I'm done doing that." My mom laughed nervously. "Brian, this isn't the time for—" "It is," I interrupted gently, Because this setup depends on it. They looked confused, slightly offended, like I'd broken an unspoken rule. My dad straightened. You're overthinking this. You've always helped. We trust you. I nodded. You trust me to handle things. You don't support me when I need help. Mark chose that moment to walk in from the kitchen, coffee in hand, oblivious. What's going on? My dad waved him off. Just logistics. I looked at Mark, really looked at him, relaxed, unworried, still insulated by choices that were never his alone. I'm stepping back, I said louder now so everyone heard from all of it. My mom's smile faded. Stepping back, how I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies, emails, notes, the old draft, the contingency language my dad had once joked about and never finalized. Alongside it, a summary I prepared outlining exactly how much of their system depended on my unpaid, unacknowledged involvement. I'm not listed anywhere officially, I continued, which means I'm not obligated to continue informally. My dad's face changed then, not anger, concern. You wouldn't just walk away, he said. That would put us in a difficult position. I held his gaze. You put me in a difficult position repeatedly. Silence settled heavy and uncomfortable. My mom tried again, softer. We didn't know it was that bad for you. I nodded. I told you when it mattered. You chose not to hear it. Mark shifted uncomfortably. This feels extreme, he muttered. I looked at him. So did watching you get 6 months of rent paid while I was facing eviction. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, there was nothing rehearsed to say. I stood up. I'm not asking for anything, I said. No money, no apologies. I'm just informing you that starting now, I'm not the safety net anymore. You'll need to formalize responsibilities or hire professionals. I won't be involved unless there's mutual respect and clear boundaries. My dad's voice was tight. You're doing this because you're angry. No, I replied. I'm doing this because I bounced back and I finally see my worth. I left then. No shouting, no slammed doors. The fallout didn't hit immediately. It crept in. Within weeks, things started slipping. Tasks went undone. Decisions stalled. Professionals cost money and asked questions my parents weren't used to answering. The convenience they'd taken for granted vanished. They called. I didn't rush to answer. When I did, I was polite, brief, unavailable. Mark struggled more than anyone. Without my quiet guidance, his plans unraveled faster. He asked for advice. I told him to trust his judgment just like he'd once told me. My parents tried a different approach. Then guilt, concern, long talks about family and sacrifice. I listened. I didn't bend. The real reckoning came months later at another family gathering. Smaller this time, tense. He pulled me aside. You've changed, he said. Yes, I agreed. You used to be dependable. I still am, I replied. Just not for people who depend on me without supporting me. He looked tired, older than I remembered. My mom joined us, eyes glossy. We didn't realize how much we leaned on you. I nodded. That's the problem. There was no dramatic apology, no tearful confession, just acknowledgement. Too late to undo the past, but enough to change the future. Mark avoided my eyes the rest of the evening. I didn't feel victorious driving home. I felt steady. In the months that followed, my work solidified into something permanent, better than what I'd lost. I moved to a new place smaller, but mine built entirely on my own terms. My parents adjusted. They had to. The family dynamic shifted permanently, less comfortable, more honest. And me, I stopped shrinking myself to make others comfortable. I didn't win money. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I did something better. I removed myself as the invisible support holding up a system that never valued me. They learned what I was worth the moment I stopped giving it away. And the funny thing is, I really did bounce back, just not in the way they expected.